Hello, everyone, and welcome to the e-Renew webinar series on Europe and the World. I'm Carrie Otterburn of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, and I'll be your host and moderator. Today, we are joined by Professor Anita Gohdes, who will discuss her new book, Corporate Crime and Punishment, The Politics of that's last week's. Who will discuss her new book, Repression in the Digital Age, Surveillance, Censorship, and the Dynamics of State Violence. Apologies, I was just discussing the book from Professor Vole, which was our previous webinar, which is a very good webinar, and you can find it on our website. But today we are with Anita Gohdes, who will discuss her book on Repression in the Digital Age, Surveillance, Censorship, and the Dynamics of State Violence. And this was published by Oxford University Press in 2023. Anita is professor of international and cybersecurity at the Hertie School in Berlin, and she works at the intersection of international security and technology. Previously, she was assistant professor of international relations at the University of Zurich and postdoctoral research fellow with the International Security Program at Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center. Since 2009, she has worked for the California-based nonprofit organization Human Rights Data Analysis Group. She has advised the German Federal Foreign Office and has consulted for the World Bank and the United Nations on security and state fragility. Also joining us today as discussant is Dr. Philip de Man. Philip is research manager at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies and a lecturer in space law at the Advanced Master of Science in Space Studies of the University of Leuven. His research focuses on EU space governance, international space law, and international telecommunication law. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation by Anita of approximately 30 minutes, and then we will turn over to Philip to kick off the discussion with some of his reflections and questions. Then we will turn to questions from you, the audience. So please feel free to send questions for the speakers at any point during the webinar by using the webinar Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of the Zoom window. I will collect your questions to share with the speakers during the open Q&A, which will follow the presentations. Before we begin, just a few words about the e-Renew project. The EU Research Education Network on Europe and the World, or e-Renew, is an Erasmus Jean Monnet network bringing together 19 higher education institutions from Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, with the goal of improving knowledge and enhancing debate on the EU's role in an ever-changing world. On behalf of e-Renew, I'd really like to thank Anita and Philip for joining us today, and it is my great pleasure to hand over the floor to Anita.
Thank you so much, Kari, and thank you so much to everyone who's joining in. It is fantastic to have so many people here. Whoops. Now I have to there we go. Okay. I'm delighted to be presenting my work in this webinar. As Kari already said, it's on my book, Repression in the Digital Age. It was published in December 2023. So depending on what version you're getting, it's either 2023 or 2024. I will be giving you a short overview of kind of the key argument in the book, provide some framing and context, and then I'll give you kind of some spotlights of the types of data and analysis that I did within the project. So the kind of overarching motivation, it might be helpful for us to look a little bit at the context of how internet usage has evolved over time. And in the book, I'm kind of looking at this period from 1990, where most countries slowly, were even just kind of thinking about allowing people in their respective countries to join the internet, up until 2017. And what I've done here is divided up the average share of individuals using the internet by the type of political system that they live in. So the dotted line that you see at the top are liberal democracies. Then we have the next line is closed autocracies, so autocracies without any types of elections. Then we have these electoral democracies, so democracies that do have regular elections but might not be considered liberal. And then we have so-called electoral autocracies, so competitive autocracies, where there might be elections, but it's pretty clear that they're not free and fair. And what's really interesting about this graph, if we look at it, is that up until about 2005, so the kind of mid-2000s, most people who were online were actually living in liberal democracies. And then in the kind of mid-2000s, we see that these other countries really start to catch up. And so that really changes who is using the internet, what's happening online, maybe the types of discussions that are happening online. And if you're as old as I am, then you remember the kind of 2010s being a time where there was a lot of discussion about so-called liberation technology. And this really coincides with this upswing of people using the internet outside of liberal democracies. So this idea that maybe the internet is a way for people in non-democratic countries or less democratic countries to kind of gain more democratic rights and freedoms and so on. Now we're in 2025 now. We know that that was not necessarily a promise that held, but it's still really interesting to kind of look at this pattern over time. And one question that might arise would be, well, if the internet really is something that would help people, gain access to political freedoms, to new types of information, why would these non-democratic countries actually allow people to go online? One of the big kind of central starting points for me in this project is that governments in general still have control over digital infrastructure. Now, it's very difficult to find a picture to demonstrate what digital infrastructure looks like, but I like to use the kind of parallel of electricity. So this is a picture now more than 10 years old from the Hong Kong protest, the umbrella protest in September 2014. And what we can see here are people who are mobilizing, demonstrating against state authority, but they still require state infrastructure to actually fuel their protests, right? So people here are charging their phones, charging their batteries, and so on and so forth. And they're doing that because it helps them connect. But this is, of course, electricity that's being provided by the state. And so very similarly, we can think about digital infrastructure. So because governments control digital infrastructure, it also means that they have a strong control over the politics of what that infrastructure looks like. So what we've actually seen is that over the last 2 decades, now or maybe 2.5 decades even, so-called cyber controls have proliferated, and governments who've invested in digital infrastructure have also very heavily invested in these so-called cyber controls. Now, the thing I'll be looking at in this book and I'll be talking about in this presentation is what the role of these cyber controls actually are within state repression. So how do these different controls that states engage in online actually change how they repress? Now, you might be wondering what I mean by cyber controls, and I generally distinguish 2 major forms of cyber controls in the book. The one is online surveillance, which includes different types of controls such as intercepting and monitoring online information, monitoring communication, and very importantly, also monitoring metadata. So not just what you're talking about, but who you're talking to, when you're talking to them, and then also your location, of course. The second type of cyber control is so-called online censorship, and that includes much more than just, banning Twitter, for example, or now banning TikTok, right? That also includes the restricting of specific types of content. It also includes things such as throttling access. So what that means is that you might still be able to use the internet, but it's very slow. You can't send pictures and so on. There might be filtering of specific types of keywords, or there might be full-on shutting down of the internet happening. And a lot of what I'll be looking at in this presentation is actually the full shutdown of the internet. So these are the 2 types of cyber controls I'm looking at. Now, broadly speaking, the question really is, okay, we have these new technological tools, or states had these new technological tools. How do they factor into traditional forms of state repression, traditional forms of state control? And we can kind of think about different types of relations. Is that these controls might substitute traditional forms of state repression, right? So instead of engaging in violent state repression, states might kind of shift their strategies and instead engage in censorship and surveillance. The second type of relationship that we could imagine would be a complement, right? So on top of using traditional forms of physical violent repression, they now also engage in censorship and surveillance. But the 2 don't really have a lot to do with each other. They just kind of happen at the same time. The third type of relationship that we could imagine is that these cyber controls actually support and refine the original kind of traditional forms of state repression that states engage in. And then, of course, always as researchers, we have to kind of factor in the possibility that they actually have no role to play in state strategies of maintaining political power. So those are kind of the different types of relationships that we might envisage. And I'll now kind of walk you through how I think about the role of these cyber controls within state repression. My main argument is that they have actually changed how states are able to build their information infrastructure, which directly affects their repressive capabilities. So the way in which information can be used effectively within repression has changed because of cyber controls. So what that means is that these controls are actually now supporting traditional repression. They're not replacing them. So we're not seeing that states that engage in surveillance and censorship are now using less violence in the streets, for example, killing fewer people. They're using those things very concertedly together. And these cyber controls are supporting traditional forms of repression. So just very briefly, because I'm talking a lot about repression, and that's a word that's used very differently in different contexts, I wanted to just give you my definition. When I'm talking about repression, I'm talking about physical sanctions, so violence. I'm talking about people being arrested, torture, killings, and so on and so forth. So physical manifestations of violence with the intention of deterring mobilization. Right, so the state wants to make sure that people don't turn out, they don't mobilize against them, and they don't kind of try and organize some form of regime change, for example. And there are two really important forms of repression that we tend to distinguish that help us kind of think about when and where states engage in repression. The one is kind of targeted or selective repression, and the other is what we call untargeted or indiscriminate repression. When states target individuals, they do so based on individual or collective characteristics, right? You might be a dissident, and so you're targeted. You might be part of an ethnic group that the state perceives to be particularly dangerous, and so you're targeted based on a collective characteristic, which is, for example, your ethnic group. So that would be targeted repression. And then we have instances where states engage in what we might call random or indiscriminate violence, where they don't discriminate between individuals. Everyone is considered a threat and might be subjected to violence. Now, those differences are important because information plays a really important part in whether targeted or untargeted violence is used. And then just very briefly, when I think about the assumptions of when states use state repression, I think about this as something that is done with the aim to repress effectively, meaning state actors, presidents who are in power, we're now talking about autocratic regimes, aim to stay in their positions, right? They aim to use violence to remain in office. And censorship can help prevent information that can potentially incite dangerous thoughts and actions, right? So states might engage in violent repression, and they also might engage in censorship because they're worried about people, for example, exchanging criticism and mobilizing against the government, for example. Surveillance has a different role, which is to provide information that can distinguish between people who are potentially dangerous to the government and those who aren't. And so you can already see how surveillance and censorship become really, really important in kind of maintaining state order in non-democratic or in autocratic countries. So I briefly want to talk about some of the key differences between traditional information control, as we, for example, saw it in the former German Democratic Republic. I live in Berlin, so of course I've thought a lot about this from the perspective of the GDR. And when we compare that to what's happening online. And I want to just kind of walk you through some of those differences when we think about it for surveillance. So states have always engaged in surveillance, especially autocratic regimes have engaged in surveillance. In Berlin or in the former GDR, this was the Stasi, but we have many examples of secret services, for example, also engaging in extensive surveillance to kind of figure out who might be a quote unquote enemy of the state. Now, what was really interesting about these big structures, such as the one that the Stasi built in Germany, was that these were single purpose infrastructures. They were built for one specific purpose, and that was to be able to extract information on who might be an enemy of the state. And we have a lot of work, especially from historians, that talk about how incredibly expensive these networks were. So it took a very long time. Sometimes it took decades to build these kind of informant networks that would then rat out people who might have been a threat to the government. And what that basically meant was that it took a very long time to build them, but it also meant that there was differential access depending on whether people trusted these informants or not, right? So some people are just much more critical or much less likely to share information. And so they might have been much more difficult to surveil than others, which meant that these infrastructures just took a very long time to even start functioning. But then also once they started functioning, they didn't function equally well everywhere. But there was a really important advantage, and that was that these autocratic states were able to engage in full-on censorship, shut down all of the media, completely control the TV networks, for example, and radio, and still be able to collect information on what was happening in the population because they had these extensive kind of in-person informant networks. Now, I'm saying that because things online are very, very different, right? None of us, well, I would venture out to say that none of us bought our smartphone and use our computers because we want to be surveilled, right? We do that because we're actually interested in using the internet for other types of things, right? So what that means is that instead of the state having to build the single purpose infrastructure, it can rely on us using the internet, basically relying on mass adoption of the internet. The type of information that's available has completely changed, right? We now share text messages with people, we use social media that can be surveilled, and it gives, in theory, people who are interested in surveilling us very, very different types of and new forms of information that might be quite useful to figure out if we support the government, if we don't support them, what the likelihood is that we join a protest, and so on and so forth. Right? So all of that is quote unquote good news for a state that's interested in controlling us. But there's also some bad news from the state perspective, which is that this infrastructure was not just built for surveillance, right? So not only are people able to monitor what I'm doing, I can also use it to get at new types of information, to connect with other people, to start planning protests, to mobilize, and so on and so forth. And so there's a certain level of danger that comes with this new infrastructure that states somehow need to control, right? And this is where the key difference comes in when we think about in-person surveillance versus online surveillance. Online surveillance is very sensitive to online censorship. As soon as you shut down the internet or you shut down a very, very popular platform, you have no way of collecting that data anymore, right? And so the quality of information that you get changes with censorship. And so suddenly it becomes a trade-off between, do I want to collect as much information as possible, or do I want to make sure that people actually can't exchange viewpoints, mobilize, spread information, and so on and so forth. And this key difference is something that then informs when states choose to engage in surveillance activities versus when they choose to engage in censorship activities. So just to kind of put this on one page, what I expect is that online surveillance, which requires internet access, provides really useful intelligence for states to enable targeted forms of repression or violence. And it also provides access to new sectors of the population that were previously hard to reach, right? Because people might not have trusted you in the past. Now you can kind of harvest their data online. Online censorship helps make sure that people don't use the internet for mobilization, but at the same time, it limits access to this intelligence, right? So we're more likely to see states engage in online censorship when they also engage in more indiscriminate forms of repression and they don't really need access to kind of more targeted information. So what that means is that I assume that increased control of internet access is going to be associated with an increase in indiscriminate or random repression. When we see the internet shut down, when we see extreme censorship exercise, we're going to see just more violence and more indiscriminate violence. When internet accessibility is good, and we know that states are engaging in surveillance, we're going to see more targeted forms of repression. And I'll show you in a moment how I think about that from an empirical standpoint. And the most important thing is that in areas and groups that were previously very difficult for the state to monitor, in these areas and for these groups, internet accessibility really changes how much states are able to actually target them or not. And so it provides kind of a new way for repressive states to reach groups that were previously very, very hard to reach. So what I do in the book is I provide 3 different types of evidence to kind of study and analyze whether these relationships have any empirical validity. The first is that I study the Syrian conflict, specifically the first years of the Syrian conflict in depth. I look at nationwide patterns of internet shutdowns and look at how they coincide with mass repression used by the regime. And then I also look at regional internet accessibility. So how do variations in the degree to which the Syrian government allowed people to use the internet coincide with different patterns of violence that were used? All of this is done in a quantitative way. Then the second kind of chunk of empirical evidence that I provide is from the case of Iran. And specifically here, I was interested in studying how the nature of violence changed, used by various Iranian security forces during the full internet shutdown that occurred in 2019. And then I also present global evidence on how internet shutdowns and state repression over a longer period of time across a lot of different countries coincide, what we see there in terms of correlations. And I'll briefly talk about these kind of 3 parts just to kind of give you an idea of what the evidence looks like. So the first bit is on Syria, and I was saying earlier to Kari, it's still very new and unusual for me to talk about the Syrian regime in the past tense. So if I slip back into present tense, it's just because this change has been, this is still a very new change, and I think it's, it's really, really interesting to now that we have more or a larger ability to see what's happening or what happened in Syria under the Assad regime, to also kind of go back and see how much of this can be understood. But if we kind of go back more than a decade, we know that from the beginning of the Syrian uprising and then the subsequent Syrian conflict, the Syrian government engaged in extreme forms of censorship and surveillance. So they made use of all different types of computer spyware that was built by Syrian computer scientists, that was bought from many Western companies, that was bought from all types of spyware providers. And they also engaged in monitoring, for example, of social media quite extensively. And at the same time, because the government or members of the government remained in full control of the digital infrastructure, they were able to actually shut down the internet with the flip of a switch, both nationwide, but then also in different regions. And so we have this variation in the level of accessibility that kind of helps us then kind of understand to what extent violence and variations in internet accessibility actually coincided. So I collected together with colleagues data, and we analyzed data of more than 60,000 killings that were perpetrated by the Syrian regime between 2013 and 2014. And I used supervised machine learning techniques to determine whether those killings were targeted, so selecting individual people, or whether they occurred in a more random setting. And what you can see here, if you can see it on the screen, is basically the variation in internet accessibility across different regions, different governorates within Syria. And you can see that there's quite a lot of variation, both within governorates and across governorates, in terms of whether people were able to access the internet or not. And there are 2 big findings from the study. The first is that online surveillance significantly is related to more targeted violence. So where the government permits people to access the internet, where they're engaging in extensive surveillance, we're much more likely to see people who were directly targeted by snipers, who were arrested, tortured, and killed, and not just kind of targeted in a random way. The second big finding is that these effects are more pronounced in areas where it was harder for the government to collect information via offline methods. For example, because they didn't have troops on the ground at the time, or those areas were controlled by other groups. And so in those areas, the internet actually provided new forms of, new ways for the government to collect information. I'll now just very briefly talk about Iran. And and this nationwide shutdown that happened in 2019. Since then, we've seen multiple of these kind of mass shutdowns happening, but I think this is a really instructive case for us to kind of think about how shutdowns actually help states engage and frame violence. So if you don't remember, in November 2019, the Iranian regime announced a 200% increase in the price of petrol, which sparked immediate and widespread protests across the country. And within the first 48 hours of the protests, the government instituted a full shutdown of the World Wide Web. What's important here, and I'm happy to talk about that more in the Q&A, is that the national intranet, so within Iran, actually remained intact. So people were able to use domestic apps to talk to each other, but there was basically no contact available with the outside world. And this is just data kind of showing how that massive dip happened on the 16th of November. Now, what happened following the shutdown was mass repression by security and paramilitary forces, and the use of tools and live ammunition that was identified very quickly by human rights experts as a shoot-to-kill strategy, right? So this is extreme forms of repression being used. At the same time, thousands were arrested and detained across the country, and we saw a silencing of relatives and friends of the victims, pressuring them not to speak out and draw attention to what was happening. At the same time, the state media were reporting that these protesters were rioters and they were foreign conspirators. And many of the people who attended protests had their mobile phones confiscated after they were arrested. So what that means is that all of these different points point towards a strategy that, together with the shutdowns, allowed for intimidation, hiding of violence, and the controlling of a certain narrative that the government, of course, wanted to push. And experts very quickly established that there was about a time lag of 24 hours in international reports on what was actually happening in the country. Now, the graph that you see down here is the hourly number of video material that was made available to the Amnesty Iran team that has a network of people in Iran who generally provides video evidence to them on what's happening, for example, during protests. And we have a high density, as you can see, before the shutdown starts, which you can see in red. And then that kind of slows down to a kind of a drizzle of information that we get. And what's important is that even once the internet comes back on, we don't see kind of a picking up of information. So we can kind of conclude that the shutdown was actually quite successful at delaying and really kind of limiting the amount of information that we have on what happened during this time period. I'll just very quickly say something about what happened once the internet turned back on. And that is that we do see that far more people, once the internet comes back on within Iran, are actually interested in using censorship evasion technology. So this is just the number of daily users of the Tor software, which is a way to anonymize what you're doing on the internet. And we see that more people are interested in using that once the internet comes back on, which means that these shutdowns also have a backlash effect for governments, which is that they can trigger kind of increased interest in evading censorship. Okay, I'm looking at the time. I have a few more minutes left, so I will just very briefly say that if we look at the broad patterns of internet outages and state repression, we can kind of see whether, in general, internet outages are associated with a higher use of state violence. And the reason why it was really important for me to look at this at the global level is because oftentimes when governments shut down the internet, we've seen this, for example, happen in various countries in sub-Saharan Africa, the justification for that is that they say we're doing this to prevent hate speech or prevent the spiraling of disinformation. And we're actually doing this to kind of make sure that violence doesn't spiral. If you're interested in the data, I can talk more about that in the Q&A. There's some really interesting network-based measurement that we now have for internet outages. But basically what I want to show you is that even controlling for lots and lots of different factors that explain or account for different levels of human rights violations, countries that engage in internet shutdowns are much less likely to be in low repressive categories, which here using the political terror scale would be levels 1 and 2, and much more likely to be in the highly repressive categories, which here is kind of levels 3, 4, and 5. And so even if the justification is that internet shutdowns are used to kind of limit violence or limit hate speech, we don't find any empirical support for that relationship. We indeed find that they're more likely to engage in higher levels of violent repression. Okay, very briefly, some key takeaways. As I said in the beginning, I think given what we know about how cyber controls work, we see that they've transformed traditional surveillance and censorship, and they haven't replaced violent repression at all. Instead, they are taking on a supportive role in states' repressive apparatus, in particular, as I said before, in autocratic countries. They've also provided access to previously hard to reach sectors of society. So if states previously had a hard time collecting information on certain ethnic groups, on groups that are far removed from the capital city, for example, they now have an easier time doing that using the internet. This also has implications for transnational repression, because of course you can now also start monitoring people who are living in other countries that might have been much harder to do before. My kind of main takeaway here is that technology currently tips the balance of power in favor of repressive regimes. That doesn't mean that always has to be the case, but given the current kind of setup and the way that we see that states are exploiting their control of digital infrastructure, we're more likely to see that it's actually helping repressive regimes than, for example, pro-democracy movements. This has a lot of implications for how we think about the politics of digital infrastructure. Internet access and control are not neutral at all. We're having a lot of these discussions now, of course, if we think about Ukraine, for example, if we think about Starlink, so we can maybe talk about that a bit in a moment as well. This has implications for international trade. Most of these autocratic regimes that I have studied have imported filtering software, oftentimes from democratic countries. And so we really have to think about kind of the export controls here as well. And lastly, it has implications for how activists and human rights defenders and frankly, regular citizens think about their own digital security, both online and offline. If you're interested in this, this is the book that I wrote, and I'm happy to answer questions. And I'm also happy to answer any emails that you might want to send me on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Gohdes. This was super interesting, and I hope I'm picking up this book very soon. But thank you for managing to condense all that information into a short half an hour. I think that there's so much more to say, but I appreciate that very quick but very insightful overview. So now we will pass over to Philip to kick off the discussion, but I just wanted to remind the audience that you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window to send in your questions. And after we kick off this discussion, we will turn to your questions. Over to you, Philip.
Thank you, Carrie. Thank you so much, Professor Gohdes, for your talk, for your presentation. Really insightful, and I think it highlights a lot of what makes the book such an engrossing read. So I was very delighted to have the opportunity to read it and to discuss it here with you a bit. My idea is to give, let's say, some appreciation of the book and its strengths in the first couple of 5 minutes or so, and then segue into 1 or 2 questions, and then hopefully by the time we reach that, we have some questions in the Q&A section as well. So obviously it's quite topical, as I'm sure everybody tells you when they read the book. And it's also just an excellent account that illustrates how states, use digital technologies to suppress dissent. Why governments also choose certain forms of digital control, which is something that, it's obvious if you read it, I guess, and that's the strength of your book because it illustrates it in such a clear way, but it's something that is not necessarily always clear how it's really connected to different types of objectives and different types of control. So, and as somebody who does not have a technological background myself, but who occasionally does dabble in reading and writing some more, let's say, technological inspired legal issues concerning telecommunication and space law and cyber, it's really clear that the main strength of the book, at least for me, is that it touches upon a complex issue, but it does very clearly lay out the core issues that arise from the complex interplay. And I think what the book does really well is to make an abstract, in the literal sense, an intangible, as you said yourself, subject with deep technological implications, making it tangible by combining a theoretical framework as you have developed it, which is at the same time, incisive, but also quite intuitive, and combine that with, an in-depth quantitative empirical research based on case studies. And then the end result, I think, is anything but abstract, but very tangible, very clear, and can be used by, let's say, academics, but also policymakers and people without, any real background in the material as well. So as I mentioned, I think one of the main things that I take away from the book is how it illustrates how the implementation of what are ostensibly, to the layperson, very similar cyber repression and control tools, how that usage is ultimately shaped by the priorities of a political regime, right? Whether they seek to indiscriminately suppress dissent, or if they want to target specific individuals for retribution. And I think it's really interesting just to read how you connect the choice between internet restrictions and active censorship on the one hand, and internet provision for the purpose of digital surveillance, essentially, on the other hand, with the capacity and the objectives of a regime. And I think that's really a key insight, and something that has struck me. And you have clearly been following the developments in Syria and Iran for quite a long time, and I think the chapters discussing these regimes by themselves already are kind of worth the, let's say, call it the price of admission for the book. And I think the analysis of internet shutdowns during the Syrian civil conflict really helps to make you understand how all these things that we have heard about in the news and read about in the news, how they actually fit into or may fit into this larger strategy that is implemented on a large scale to conceal violent military offensives and other objectives. And then the Iran chapter, on the other hand, shows a similar thing, but from a very different perspective, I think. So how a nationwide internet shutdown can be implemented in response to spontaneous mass protests, which themselves were facilitated by the use of the same tools that are being used against the people. So I think together these case studies are really interesting because they not only exemplify the dual use of digital tools for both oppression and obfuscation, but they also raise questions about the accountability of regimes in the digital age, which go beyond simply autocratic regimes. I think the penultimate chapter, I think chapter 8, where it talks about the global implications, the broader implications, the global tendencies that we have witnessed in the last couple of years, that there's a lot of, let's say, governance implications, human rights implications that are just very difficult to control. And this is kind of leading up to my first question, which is about this connection or the link between the type of political regime and the way in which these coercive tools may be used, and what the implications are of the fact that it's a democratic regime or an autocratic regime, or whether it's private actors involved, or really just a state-controlled infrastructure. So that is obviously inspired by a lot of recent events. So we increasingly see influential figures in democratic countries, most conspicuously Elon Musk in recent weeks and months, try to leverage social media platforms to amplify certain political narratives, to challenge established institutions, and potentially destabilize democratic regimes, whether that's in Germany or in the UK or in Canada. And it's part of kind of a larger trend, I think, that raises concerns about the concentration of power in the hands of a few individuals who control key communication platforms. And obviously, it's not just about social media platforms, it's also about AI models, where there's an entire lack of transparency, lack of regulation, even regarding the algorithmic biases, the content moderation, and so forth. And here the music box of my son is suddenly starting to play. Okay, whatever. It's a nice background noise for dystopian reality. Okay, so you touched upon this issue, I think, at the very end of your book, where what we see happening in democratic regimes at the hands of private companies more and more kind of mirrors the situation in the autocratic regimes that you've discussed. For example, in Syria, where you mentioned, the concentration of power is accompanied by a monopolization of the digital infrastructure. And that's really key to leveraging these coercive tools. And obviously, autocratic regimes are by nature more prone to such a concentration of power. But oligarchy, as Biden in his final address warns us about, can also take root in democracy. So my question is a long one, I guess, but it's essentially it boils down to how do the dynamics that we have seen develop in democratic regimes in recent years differ from what you have described in your book in autocratic regimes? So to what extent are the threats different? Are the possible democratic responses to those threats different? And how important is it that we are talking here about not just the state apparatus, but also private actors being involved in the process?
Yeah, Philip, thank you so much for both for your comments and the question. And I was typing along and put kind of questions of accountability in bold font, because I think that's a really interesting kind of overarching question that you asked there. But I think the question of the link between the type of political regime and the coercive tools that might be used is a really, really interesting one. So in the book, I very much wanted to make clear at the beginning that my scope in the book really is about kind of non-democratic countries, which might include countries that, are on the brink of being autocratic, or somewhere in between. I think we've kind of gone away from this binary idea that some countries are democratic and some are autocratic. There's a lot of countries that are somewhere in between, but in general, I'm not talking about countries that have kind of these democratic checks and balances that we tend to think about. That said, I think there is a strong argument to be made to think about these tools as autocratic tools of cyber, or autocratic methods or practices that may also be used in democracies. And I think the main piece of evidence that we have for that is that many of these tools, whether it be filtering tools, whether it be shutdowns, whether it be the use of very sophisticated spyware, if you think about Pegasus, for example, are also used in democracies and in fully democratic countries. So not like countries that we think about on the brink. And so I would think about that as authoritarian practices used within democracies. Now, the violent implications might be quite different. So the level of violence that we see that goes hand in hand with these cyber controls in autocracies is oftentimes very high and might be much lower in democratic countries, because the electoral consequences of using that level of violence, not in all democracies, but in many democracies, would just be really severe. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be investigating the kind of nuances of what that looks like within democracies. I think that would be a whole nother book, and I think that would be very good if someone kind of looked at that in more detail. But we see quite similar patterns arising within democratic countries as well. Again, I really recommend to anyone listening to this to kind of look into some of the investigations around Pegasus, the Pegasus software that was used in many European countries that had, I think, an impact in terms of people being arrested, but also an impact in terms of people self-censoring themselves, demobilizing, being more fearful about, for example, engaging in critical investigations and so on. And so the stifling effect, the demobilizing effect within democracies can also be quite high. The other thing I don't talk about too much in the book is the role of propaganda, which of course is a form of cyber control that is extremely prevalent and oftentimes is kind of executed hand in hand between state and non-state actors. So regular citizens might engage in it, foreign states might engage in it, but it's of course also a really, really relevant and important part of these cyber controls. I think the point that you made about the monopolies, it really hits the nail kind of on the head. So even before Elon Musk bought X and wielded the extreme power that he now does in terms of actually actively and overtly wanting to influence politics within different European countries, and of course also in the US. I was sometimes asked about the role of Starlink, right? Because the role of of course, we could think about Starlink as a really exciting alternative for internet provision in countries that have state monopolies. But in the same way, that again is producing a certain type of monopoly, which is a private actor that has the capacity to provide digital infrastructure that no one else does. And so I think even though the logic of most private actors is a little bit different and is not maybe directly interested in forcing a certain political outcome in the way that we now see it with Elon Musk, the dangers that are related to having specific monopolies and specifically states acting as companies acting as quasi-states is very similar. And so I think the other example would be Facebook. In many of the maybe semi-democratic countries or semi-autocratic countries that I've studied, Facebook is the internet. It's the platform that's mostly used, right? And so you can think about how changes in the availability of information on those platforms basically have very similar implications as state monopolies would have. And so, and the same goes, of course, now if we think about the mainstreaming of AI technology online. So I think the monopolies themselves are probably the kind of key issue here. And then, of course, the politics behind them might be slightly different, but I'm very worried about that as well.
Okay, thank you. Kari, I'm not sure if we want to pass the floor to the, or allow for some questions from the audience. I mean, I have one further question, but we might want to.
Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so the other question that I had was related to the change in the Syria regime, in the Assad regime, right? So I don't think you slipped up in your presentation and went back to the present tense. So, but it is something. It's a startling development, obviously. I'm not too sure how well you've kept track of all these developments and maybe possibly also the changing role of digital tools in all of that. But my question is kind of related to that. So given the fact that the Syrian regime has for so long, or at least for quite a number of years, and quite effectively relied on digital surveillance and repression to maintain control, what are your views on how maybe the dynamics of digital politics and international responses to this cyber repression has evolved in the lead up to the fall of the Assad regime in December of last year? So it's trying to kind of also put back a positive spin on the whole story and see if your assessment of let's say the balance is still tipping in favor of autocratic regimes, if that's been if that view has been, let's say, modified a little bit or nuanced a little bit, among other things, by those events in Syria in the last couple of months. So does this change your view on the role of digital tools in either propping up or dismantling authoritarian regimes?
That's a really interesting question. And I'm going to speculate now because I haven't studied this in detail, and I might eat my words in the future. But I would, and I say this as someone who has spent the last 10 years kind of really kind of wanting to get people to take the role of cyber controls more seriously. My sense is that in the case of the regime turnover now within Syria, the internet played a very minor role. So I wouldn't kind of overstate the role there in terms of fostering regime change. I do think that the new regime, if we can call it that, I'm not sure exactly the new leaders within the country, are inheriting a very powerful system of, especially of surveillance, and of course also of control of the internet, and a system of surveillance that predates the internet as well, right? So as I talk about in the book as well, of course, that surveillance was not something that was invented through the internet in Syria, but has a kind of long-standing tradition under the Assad dynasty. And so I think when we think about it maybe from a European foreign policy perspective, really thinking about how the rebuilding of Syria takes into account having to reform the digital sector in a way that provides digital safeguards, and make sure that people's rights there are respected, because the current system that has been inherited is one that provides a lot of power to the new rulers that I think is can potentially be very, very dangerous. And so I know that that's oftentimes not on the priority of kind of foreign policy objectives of European foreign ministers, but I think it's something that really needs to be taken into account.
No, it's true. It's interesting that they have kind of targeted potential chemical weapon sites for demolition before it could turn into the hands of the new regime, but maybe they have thought about the entire surveillance infrastructure that's existing as well. But it's in keeping with your argument that it's a new type of repression that is supporting existing traditional means of violence, it's indeed important that the international community take that into account as well. So yeah,
definitely. And the question of sanctions there is a huge one as well, right? So many Iranian digital rights activists who are based outside of Iran have said that one of the big problems of the extreme sanctions regime against Iran is that it's actually also hindering the civilian population's ability to make use of some of the tools that would actually help them kind of mobilize against the regime, right? And so building a new digital infrastructure within the country in the context of the existing sanctions, of course, is something that also needs to kind of be investigated.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We can turn now to a couple of questions from the audience. We have a first one on the internet shutdown in some African countries. So reflecting on the complete internet shutdown in some African countries, do these rulers also choose this option because their technologies for surveillance are less advanced than in other countries? In other words, is there a relationship between the availability of certain types of technology and then the choice for censorship or surveillance tools? And do you think that human rights legislative initiatives that are evolving in countries that are exporting some of these dual-use technologies or surveillance technologies, particularly some of these newer due diligence measures, could play a role in limiting the trade of these technologies? Do you see them being able to function in this capacity or not so much? And do you see some of these dynamics that you discuss in your book playing out in the ongoing crises in Russia and Ukraine and Gaza? And if so, how do they compare or not? And then finally, a sort of practical question is, where did the data on the killings come from that you analyzed, and how did you determine whether a killing was targeted or not? And I think that's all we'll have time for at the moment.
Great. Yeah, so it's an interesting development to see that a lot of the internet shutdowns that we're now witnessing are happening in countries across sub-Saharan Africa, not only sub-Saharan Africa, but also sub-Saharan Africa, and that they're also happening in countries that do hold regular elections and that are oftentimes actually, to a certain extent, maybe not fully free and fair, but would be considered kind of legitimate elections. And specifically in these circumstances, we oftentimes see them being justified by saying we want to limit the spread of misinformation, we want to limit the spread of hate speech, and so on and so forth, right? And so the justifications there are oftentimes related to that. I would say the use of internet shutdowns there has less to do with the inability to engage in surveillance and more to do with the fact that it's easier to institute a shutdown than, for example, engage in very specific, sophisticated filtering. So, for example, we've seen relatively few shutdowns, even regional shutdowns in China in the last decade, because the Chinese government is very good at much more fine-grained surveillance. So they can filter specific keywords, they can use various forms of much more subtle censorship that might not be immediately visible and therefore just draw much less attention to themselves. So kind of brute force shutdowns are an easier way to just kind of, say, let's limit access to the entire IP space in our country than to kind of engage in more sophisticated filtering. It's actually quite interesting to see that, for example, the Ethiopian government was one of the first countries that actually engaged in quite sophisticated online surveillance. So we actually do see that there are quite a number of governments in sub-Saharan Africa that actually also do engage in quite sophisticated surveillance in places where we might not necessarily expect so. I do think the discussions we have about export controls are really important. I do think the Pegasus investigations really flagged that topic, both for the US, but also for the European Union. We've seen much more discussion about this within the European Parliament. So I am somewhat hopeful to see some changes there. I do think that the overly strong focus on individual companies has meant that we've kind of assumed that this is the only type of spyware that exists. And of course, there are very different types of spyware that are also available that just get much less media attention. And so I think there's always a risk of kind of modeling certain types of legislation based on the biggest, flashiest case that we know about and kind of neglecting some of the other ones. I think we see a lot of this playing out in Ukraine and Russia. I very briefly talk about it in the book because it's a different context. It's a kind of cross-national or an international invasion that we saw there. But we've seen repeatedly that Russia is engaged in what I would call digital annexation, where a certain area is occupied, and one of the first things the Russian forces do is that they make sure that the data is rerouted via Russian internet service providers, for example, via Crimea. And that, of course, then immediately allows the control of digital infrastructure, allows the large-scale harvesting of data, but then also allows them to engage in internet shutdowns. The case of Gaza, I think, is a little bit different. I've talked to digital rights specialists who are either based in Gaza or based in Palestine and Israel, and who said that there has been some intentional shutting down, but much more of it has just been the physical damaging of infrastructure, which of course is not reversible as quickly. It's much more kind of the brute force destruction that we've seen there. I think we could have a much longer discussion about the use of AI and the targeting of targets within Gaza, but I think that's a slightly different discussion. And your last question was about
just the data on the killings. Yeah.
So you mentioned at the beginning that I've been working with a nonprofit organization called the Human Rights Data Analysis Group now for more than 15 years. And very early on in the Syrian conflict, the UN Human Rights Office commissioned Human Rights Data Analysis Group to analyze data on killings that were occurring within Syria. And so now since about 2012, we've worked together with Syrian documentation groups to clean, collect, and analyze data on what we know in terms of killings of what occurred within Syria. And so the analysis that I present in the book is based on this data that was collected in the name of the UN Human Rights Office, and includes for this time period, more than 60,000 killings, but for the entire time period, many more. So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of killings. And because the data was collected by incredibly courageous human rights groups, they include details on how people were killed. So for example, were they arrested first? Were they killed by snipers? Were they killed in aerial attacks? And so that kind of unstructured text is what I then use or I apply these kind of text analysis tools to then classify whether each killing occurred in a more targeted way or in a more indiscriminate way.
That is very interesting and depressing. That's very interesting and amazing work. That is unfortunately all the time we have for today. But hopefully we can see some of you again in our next webinar, which will be held in actually just next week with Mark Purdon on the political economy of climate finance in developing countries. And our winter spring lineup is also online at eu-renew.eu, and you can see our next webinars. We have our schedule up there through the spring. But thank you so much, Professor Anita Gohdes and Dr. Philip Deman, as well as all of you in the audience today for joining us today. It was a really fascinating webinar and a fascinating and timely topic. So thanks very much for being here with us.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Philip, for the fantastic question.
Sure. Thank you.
And hopefully see you again soon. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.